said and why and how it applies and how we can look at it today, it makes it so much more clear of exactly why we are studying the book of Exodus. Many people say, well, why are we even looking at the Old Testament? It's the New Testament. We're under the New Covenant, yes, but the Old Testament is repeated in the New Testament over and over again. The Old Testament is extremely important. That at no time did Jesus ever say, throw out the Old Testament, we're starting over. He said, we're continuing to follow these things. I didn't come to do away with it. I came to fulfill it. And so when we look at all that and we go through this kind of study, I hope that it helps you as you're going through this time. I told somebody this week, they were talking about that they were trying to read the Bible through in a year. They were late getting started. They didn't get started in January. But they were going to try to read the Bible through in 365 days. And I told them that's a very good thing and certainly is something you can do. But I cautioned them and I said, look, if you're just planning on trying to read the Bible through in a year and that's your goal, don't get bogged down in studying the passages. Because if you start trying to study the passages as you go all the way through, you will not finish that. Go through and read it all, then go back and study the passages.
Yeah.
And mark things that you want to go back and study after. And so at seminary they told us there's a lot of ways to study the Bible. One way is to take it in big chunks. In other words, like take a whole book at a time and just read through it and go through that passage. Some of it is to take in as much as you can, as fast as you can. Some of it is to sit down and take little tiny bites and take 1 or 2 or 3 verses, maybe a small passage, and study that one passage. Sometimes you can even find one word and study that one word. You'd be surprised how many times you can find one word in the Bible and then start searching to find out how many times is that one word in the Bible. And as you scroll through and you start looking at it, you can see a difference. The word is one thing here and possibly another thing there, and you're trying to figure out why is it different. Well, it's different because it's a different tense of the verb, or it's a different application of the same word. Like for instance, the word love for us. You can say love in one way and talk about a man loving his wife. You can say love in another way and talk about a man loving pizza, right? Those are different things. But when you sit down and you look at that, it's the same word. Well, same thing in the Bible, and you start doing word studies. So in all of this Bible study, when you're doing it, I want to encourage you to do it in different ways. Take it in big chunks, take it in small chunks. Look at word studies, do things like that. What we're doing, and the way that we're doing is we're trying to take a chapter at a time, but if a chapter is too big, like this one is, then we're taking passages at a time. Sometimes we do more than one passage. Sometimes we take several passages in a night, but we're taking smaller amounts to try to fully absorb what it says so that we can get a little deeper in our understanding. Because the book of Exodus is not easy to understand. If you recall, my really good friend Mark that filled in for me a few weeks ago, I told him, you're welcome to go ahead and start on chapter 21 while I'm out of town. And he looked at chapter 21 and he said, nope, I'm not going to do that. He said, I'd have to do a lot of studying before I go and try to start breaking down chapter 21 because I hadn't looked at it in a long time. He said, it's just too much. And it was too much for him to sit down at that one moment and try to do that. And that's true. So that's why we go through these things in a small way, take little bits, and try to talk about them and see how we can apply them today. So I just wanted to put that out to everybody because sometimes it gets lost in why we do what we do. Sometimes we don't even think about it. We're just like, well, why do you go to church? Well, that's just the thing I'm supposed to do, go to church. Yeah, but why? Well, I don't know. That's just what I'm supposed to do on Sunday and Wednesday. And that's how some people might reply.
Yeah.
And if you're talking to someone who is not a church person, that's not a very good answer for them. It's just the thing I'm supposed to do. Why do you study the Bible? Well, I'm supposed to. Why? I don't know. Why did you, so the whole point is, let's understand why. And let's study this as deeply as we can. So verse 20 and 21, it says this. It says, and if a man beats his male or female servant with a rod, so that he dies under his hand, he shall surely be punished. Notwithstanding, if he remains alive a day or two, he shall not be punished, for he is his property. That's a tough verse. That's a tough passage to read that and see what are we talking about? This is crazy. So, if he beats him so that he dies under his hand, he will be punished. Basically what we're talking about is in ancient Israel, servants could be murdered, right? In many cultures, the master was held blameless if he murdered a servant. In this time, now that's being retold to the Israelites, the passage is saying, this is not right. It's not right. In the ancient times, they were a servant, they were your property, and if you decided that they had made you mad or not done what you wanted and you chose to absolutely beat them to death, it was okay. It was never okay in God's eyes, but in ancient Israel, it was okay. In other cultures, it was okay. And in this case, God is saying it's not okay, and I want you to understand that. That's not something that's okay. And so, it's changing the thinking here to make it more personal, to make you understand that that is a person. Now, then it gets confusing because it goes on and says, well, but if he stays alive a day or two, then he won't be punished. Master may not be punished if the servant didn't die immediately. Now, why is that? So it's okay if I beat them and they live 3 days and then they die. Well, okay, that's all right. But if I beat them and they died right then that was murder. How is that the case? What are we talking about here? Well, here's the real intent behind that. The intent behind that is, and it says, he shall not be punished, but the intent behind that is he won't be punished immediately. In other words, what's going to happen now is, was this intentional? Did he truly try to kill this servant? Or did he get angry and lose his temper? Remember we talked about before the difference between premeditated, right? Whether it was something that was premeditated or if it was a murder, a taking of a life out of a crime of passion or an accidental death because they just lost their temper. These are things that they're talking about. So in this case, that's kind of what it's saying. Basically what it's saying is if they don't die right away, then there's time for them to investigate and find out, was that intentional? Was that something that the master was trying to do? Did the master intentionally try to murder the servant? Was he trying to do that? If he didn't die immediately, then it could be evidence that he was struck with the intention of discipline and not being struck for the intention of murder. If he died through unintentional attack, then the loss of property was thought to be penalty enough to the master. Now, again, they're evolving from one place to another. Yes, ma'am.
Were these their servants Jews, or were their servants other nationalities?
This is the Jews with servants to Jews.
The master's a Jew and the servant.
Yes. In this case, that's what we're talking about.
Okay.
So they're all Jews. And these Jews that are servants, in almost every case, the reason they are in that situation is because they put themselves there or they were forced to go there because they couldn't pay whatever their debt was. That's how they ended up there. So they're saying that if they were just trying to discipline them and they went a little too far and the injuries that they caused them to die a few days later, then they would consider that the loss of that was enough punishment. If they died immediately, then they would say they obviously were trying to kill them and therefore they would be punished for trying to do that. That's what they were trying to do. Now, the law of Moses, it says, great consideration to the rights of the accused. And all penal laws should be construed favorably as possible to the accused. Basically what he's saying is, okay, if you're accused, we got to investigate this. Just because you're accused doesn't mean it's right. It doesn't mean that you actually did it. So we've got to investigate that. Maybe y'all heard it's something called innocent until proven guilty. Y'all heard that before? Right? It doesn't exist today in our society. It rarely exists. basically you're guilty until proven innocent now.
Yeah.
If somebody arrests you for something or pulls you over for something or does whatever, you're guilty until you can prove your innocence. It's not how it was designed to be. It's supposed to be, you got to prove the person's guilty. You got to prove their intent. You got to prove what they were trying to do. And so in this case, when we look at that, it puts it into a different context. It still doesn't seem to make it very right. It says, he shall surely be punished. Well, what punishment was he talking about in the first part? Well, these laws together have a picture of the ancient Israel slavery. A servant was a person who could not be murdered. Yet they were also considered the property of the master until their obligation was fulfilled. So they were the property, but remember, they were the property, but every 7 years they had to be released, right? So during that 7 years, they were their property. They couldn't be murdered. That wasn't something you could do. They were still the property. But then it goes on and says, well, but if they didn't die until later, well, he is their property. Literally what they're talking about is that is the money that they were owed. That's their money. That's what they were owed. That's why that person is there. And so when we look at that, the owner has an investment in this person, and he's going to lose this investment if the person dies. And so therefore, that's enough punishment. They're not going to get their money. They're not going to get whatever it was that the person that were enslaved to them for. Now, again, when we look at all this, there's such fine wording, I guess you'd say, in all of that. Is it still, I mean, what is the real case? Well, again, it goes back to the intent, right? What was the intent? Remember, we already talked about the fact that if a person murdered somebody and was found to be premeditated, then they were to be put to death. But if a person killed somebody and it was due to a crime of passion, or they just lost their temper temporarily, or something else happens to action, they pushed them and they fell down, hit their head, and they died, whatever, then in that case, they weren't put to death. They were still punished, but they weren't put to death. It's the same thing today in our laws today. If you're found guilty of first-degree murder, right, you're found guilty of premeditated murder, then most of the time they go after the death penalty. They go after the capital punishment. But if you're found guilty of manslaughter, that's a whole other thing. The punishment is not as heavy as the punishment for intentionally killing someone. The same thing was then, and the difference there was they moved from there into the people that were their property at that point, and so it changed even more. During that time that they were their property, they were still to be treated as people, they were still to be treated well, but they were still considered property. So that they were paying off their debt. So it's still it's a hard thing to think about, but still we got to look and try to understand the intent and what were they doing. Really and truly, this law was all about taking something that used to be considered perfectly okay, killing the slave if they didn't agree with what they did, and making it not okay. Making it a person would have to pay the price if they did that. Making the reality that it did give that person a personhood and not simply being property. So that's what that was all about. So speaking of losing your investment or payment or your money or whatever it is being owed to you, look at verses 22 through 25. And here it says, if men fight and hurt a woman with child so that she gives birth prematurely, yet no harm follows, he shall surely be punished accordingly as the woman's husband imposes on him. And he shall pay as the judges determine. But if any harm follows, then you shall give life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. So it's basically a law of retribution. Okay, that's what we're talking about. The pregnant woman was injured in the conflict. She gave birth early, but everybody was okay. She went into labor a little early, but the baby was okay. The mama was okay. Everybody was okay. So, okay, no harm, no foul, right? Whoa, hold up, there was a foul. Even though there was no permanent lasting damage, there was still damage. There was still problem there. So the penalty was to be assessed only if there was lasting damage. But if there was no lasting damage, then the husband still could say, this is what you owe, even if there wasn't any lasting damage. So, when you look at that part, it says, if yet no harm follows, he shall be punished accordingly as the woman's husband imposes on him. So there's still punishment even though there was not lasting damage. Now, it wasn't a penalty as far as a penalty in the eyes of, it wasn't a law, breaking a law, but it was a penalty in the eyes of the husband because his wife, his child could have possibly been injured, so he was able to do that. But if something happened and there was a death that occurred, that was going to be a whole nother thing. So it still made sure that the person was justly compensated, and the judge would also look into it. But if any harm followed, if there was harm, something happened and the child was hurt or the woman was hurt or possibly died, basically if lasting damage resulted but it wasn't quite death, then that was covered by another law. So let's say the child was born premature, and although the child didn't die, the child was deaf, or the child was lame, had a leg that was messed up that wouldn't heal. There was something that went on, something that happened. If there was some sort of damage, but it wasn't death, then it was another law, and that was retribution or restitution was due to that. So for accidental assault, then the person who was the offender, they still had to pay some compensation, even if both the child and the mother survived, and the fee would be set by the husband and agreed upon by the court. You say, oh, well, the fee was set by the husband. Get rich, right? Nothing, no big deal, no big harm, everything's okay, but yeah, now you're going to pay me a whole lot of money. No, the judge said that's not good. The judge would have to agree and tell you that that was either an acceptable amount or not. Because again, you weren't to injure that person any more than they had not injured you, right? So yes, there was something that would be paid, but you weren't trying to bankrupt the guy, there still was some kind of restitution that would have to be paid. But a judge would oversee it. And so the judge looked at it and would say, this is okay and this is not okay. But again, if there were any harm, if there was something that happened and there was actually damage, it says life for life. What does that mean? Exactly what it says. If something happened and the mother or the child, either one died, then the person that caused the death, their penalty would be death. If something happened and the child, had a problem with something else, then that too would be punishment for the person that caused the punishment. Our tendency is to do more than what somebody did to us, right? So you understand what I mean? So James gets up here and he gives me a big shove. Well, James pushes me across the floor, I'm taking him down. I ain't taking care, I'm taking him down. I ain't gonna push him back, I'm taking him down, right? Because he pushed me, he can't get away with that. I gotta make it even worse. And then if I take him down, he's coming out with his knife. Did you see how it goes? That's how it does. Want to do worse to the person that what they did. You don't have a knife, James. You don't have a knife tonight, do you?
No.
Okay, just
I ain't no violent person.
no, that's how it goes. The people want to do worse to the person that did something to them. They don't want to do the same. They don't want to make it even. They want to do worse than whatever happened. When it says you shall give a life for life, then in ancient Israel, people were killed. People were killed in ancient Israel routinely for what we might consider an accidental death or manslaughter. So why are we having this law put out? To show you that it's not okay to take somebody's life if it was an accidental death. But if it were purposeful, then a life for a life. Then they're giving you when it is okay. You shall give life for life. And so, but there's something that you got to know. Numbers 35:31 allows a substitute ransom payment for the loss of life that was not willful and premeditated murder. Okay? Two men fighting. They hurt the woman dies. Now, life for a life. But in Numbers, they allow a substitute ransom payment. So now the man and the judge decide how much the woman's life was worth. And that's what the person has to pay. That's what they have to pay. Okay? So if that person premeditated that murder and actually murdered, that's a whole different thing. It's a life for life. There is no payment to get out of that. So you got to understand that there are things that happen, and so when we look at that, we look at all of these things that happen, whether there was damage, whether there wasn't damage, do they have to pay restitution, do they not have to pay restitution, is the restitution physical, can they pay? In every instance, even if it was an eye, right? If it was an eye, if it was a limb, if it was something like that, then they don't necessarily have to physically go take that person's eye, but they have to pay for it if it was an accident, right? So if this fighting occurred and this happened, then there is restitution for that. Now, I suppose they could enforce the eye for an eye, but that wasn't routinely something they enforced. What they meant was, if you hurt that person, if you took their eye, then you had to pay for that. If you did hurt their leg, you had to pay for that. Whatever it was, you had to give restitution. Okay, so you had to do that. Today, that's one of the things that we're so quick, especially in our society, we're so quick to say, well, my fault.
Yeah.
Wasn't my fault. We were fighting and I knocked them down, but I slipped on this floor. Somebody had mopped this floor and didn't put a sign out that said the floor is wet. It's their fault. No, they weren't fighting. You were fighting. But now I'm trying to pass the blame. It's somebody else's fault. Somebody else did it. It's not my fault. And so, yes, I used to tell my daughters, if it happened to you, it's your fault. You did it. It's your fault, right? Too many times we're not willing to take the blame for something that happens when it happens. Make restitution. If something happens, that was what we're supposed to do. But in our society, that's gone so far to the other side. How many of you watched any television today? Anybody watch TV today?
I did.
Okay, out of all you that watch TV today, how many of you saw a lawyer commercial? You saw a lawyer commercial. How many of you saw a lawyer commercial for a car accident victim?
Oh, see it all the time. Yeah.
Okay, so when you see these commercials, what are they saying? Come see us. We get the biggest settlements. I got $500,000 from whoever, right?
Yeah.
Come see me. I got this much money from this lawyer. Got me this much money. Well, did you suffer that kind of loss? Was there really that involved, or did you lose a couple days' work while your car was repaired and it was a minor accident?
Yeah.
Oh, but pain and suffering, I need this much money. But was there really any pain or suffering? You see, it's the same thing I was talking about before. If James pushes me, I got to do more to him. If they had an accident, they got to get more money. Restitution was not designed to get rich.
Oh, agreed.
Now, here's another reason why I say that. Pardon me. Has anybody ever heard that you shouldn't sue a Christian brother? Anybody ever heard that?
I ain't heard that.
I'll tell you one thing, don't ever get a Christian lawyer.
For real?
Okay,
No,
listen. This is the reason I say, has you ever heard, don't sue a Christian brother?
I ain't heard that.
What it actually means is, you're not to wrongly treat a brother in a case that something like that's going on. If restitution is needed from a brother in Christ or sister, it should be an eye for an eye. It should equal. Whatever they lost, the payment should equal. Whatever you lost, the payment should equal. It shouldn't be, oh, well, I lost this, so I got to get $1 million, right? And so that's the whole point that we're talking about here is, why are we talking about all this? So that in this case, so the Hebrews understood how to treat their other Hebrews, how they understood. There was a restitution, but it was only a restitution that matched what had happened. It wasn't something that was done so they could get rich. In
Yeah, great.
In this case, what we see or what we conclude in this is that the person that caused the injury, they must surrender to the deceased child's father or husband a monetary value for each life or either life, whatever was taken. They must give that to them because of the damage that they caused, because of the life that they took. If it was considered premeditated and they actually went searching to cause that death on purpose, it was a life for a life, and they would lose their life. In this case, there was a monetary compensation. Then you say, well, how do you put a monetary value on something like that? How do you put a monetary value on how much for a person? You know, I lost my wife and child. Where do I find the monetary value for that? There's not an easy answer to that. In most cases, what they did during that time is they considered what does a wife give to the family, and how much would that cost if you had to hire somebody out to do it. Y'all seen that on the internet today, right? A wife saying, let me show you how much my services are worth. And they start putting out all the things that they do and how much it would actually cost if you had to pay somebody to come do all that. That's kind of what they would do, something along those lines. And they would put a value based on, in that person's life, all these things that they did that now they won't do, this would be the value, and so you need to pay that. So that was kind of how they did that. So, now, there's more laws of retribution. So, let's look at 26 and 27. It says, if a man strikes the eye of his male or female servant and destroys it, he shall let him go free for the sake of his eye. And if he knocks out the tooth of his male or female servant, he shall let him go free for the sake of his tooth.
Bless that too.
So, again, in ancient times, that wasn't the case at all, because that person was property. They could do with what they want, right? They could do whatever they wanted to, and it didn't matter. The laws would not punish them if they did something like that. But once this came out, and once this is being given to the children of Israel, it's showing them that's not okay.
All right.
You can't do that.
All right.
So it's not okay. So if you do something like that and you cause damage, then you've just ended your that you've already received all the payment you're going to get. If they lost an eye, they lost a tooth, then you've received all the payment you're going to get. They're going free.
They have to come.
They're going free.
Amen.
Okay. Now, if he knocks out the eye or the tooth, then he lets him go free. Now, it also taught them not only humanity, but it also taught them caution, right? If you're disciplining a person, you might want to be careful. Because if you cause that problem, the money you was trying to get back, you ain't getting back no more. It's gone. It taught them to use caution and not just get crazy and do whatever they wanted to. All of this, again, like I said, it used to be one way, and now the Hebrews are seeing this is how it is. So think about this. When the Israelites were slaves in Egypt, if one of the Egyptian decided to just kill one of the slaves because they weren't doing whatever, there was no punishment for that.
None.
They just killed them. If one of them beat them so badly they knocked out their eye or knocked out all their teeth, it didn't matter. None of that stuff mattered. So that's how the Israelites were treated when they were slaves. Now that they are out of that, and they're having people that are becoming their servants because of they couldn't pay their debt or they couldn't do whatever, the only thing they got to look back on how to treat a slave is how they were treated. And so now this is being put out to them to show how you will treat that person. And again, this isn't a permanent situation. They were only there for a short period of time in the overall scheme of their life. They were only there for 7 years, unless they chose to remain. They were only there for that long. So it wasn't the same as when we think about the Israelites were never going to be let go if God had not intervened. 400 years of slavery. Many of them lived their whole life and died as a slave. It's not like the slavery that we know about, where they went over to Africa and kidnapped people and put them on a ship and brought them back to the United States and sold them for the rest of their life, that they would be there forever. It's not like that kind of slavery they're talking about now. Still, I wouldn't want to have to be a slave in any way. But in this case, that was their payment. That's what they had to do because they couldn't afford to make the payment. So they were put into service until that debt was paid. Now, how do we treat them? We treat them as a person. We don't treat them as property. Yes, they are the property, and yes, that does give some outlook, make it a little bit different, but they're not. They're people, and so therefore you have to understand, if you treat them wrongly, you're going to lose that money because they're going to go free. And if you treat them so bad that you murder them, you're going to lose your life. So you can't just treat them that way. They're not just property. They are people. So they go further than that in this passage. They go from people to animals. In today's world, sometimes I think the animals are fought for more than the people. Sometimes I think there are people go after trying to put people in jail over the treatment of an animal and don't even worry about somebody's treatment of a child.
Right.
They don't worry about somebody's treatment of a spouse. But the animal, oh, we're going after it. The reality is it should be both, right? It shouldn't be treating people or animals badly. That shouldn't be happening. But the other thing, the animals that they're talking about in that day, most of them were the animals that did the work. It was the ones they used to be able to eat and to make a living and to do all of that. So look with me to 28 through 32. It says this, it says, if an ox gores a man or a woman to death, then the ox shall surely be stoned, and its flesh shall not be eaten. But the owner of the ox shall be acquitted. But if the ox tended to thrust with its horn in times past, and it has been made known to its owner, and he has not kept it confined so that it has killed a man or a woman, the ox shall be stoned, and its owner shall also be put to death. If there is imposed on him a sum of money, then he shall pay to redeem his life whatever is imposed on him. Whether it has gored a son or gored a daughter, according to this judgment, it shall be done to him. If the ox gores a male or female servant, he shall give to their master 30 shekels of silver, and the ox shall be stoned. So, there's a lot of different stuff going on there. First of all, if the ox was violent and killed somebody, the ox would be put to death. I found it interesting that it said the ox would be put to death and the flesh should not be eaten. Its flesh shall not be eaten. The reason was no one was supposed to prosper from this ox because of what it had done. No one was able to prosper from that and get anything from that because what the ox did. So that no one was supposed to do that. So it illustrated in this law, again, the principle of intent and neglect. What do you mean intent and neglect? Well, so animals are animals, right? Brother Gene, you used mules a lot when you were growing up, right? Do they sometimes get crazy? They just do some crazy stuff sometimes. That mule never did that before, and then one day he gets crazy. You don't know what he's trying to do. Animals do that kind of stuff. You've seen a cat sitting in the floor and all of a sudden out of nowhere just tear out of there like somebody lit their tail on fire. Run around the house, go crazy. They just do that sometimes. So you don't have control over everything that an animal does all the time. We understand that. Okay? So if that animal just suddenly went crazy and went after somebody and have no reason, no idea why they did that, then the person that owned that animal wasn't responsible for the way that that happened because it was an animal. And you never know what's going to happen. It was an accidental death, but even though it was an accidental death, then they want to make sure nobody profited from that death, right?
Well, tell me about this 28th verse.
Yep.
What does that mean, that he shall be quit? The
In
owner,
our King James.
Acquitted.
Read the whole verse to me.
if an ox gore a man or a woman that they die, then the ox shall be surely stoned, and his flesh not eaten, but the owner of the ox shall be quit.
That means acquitted.
Yeah.
That means acquitted. That means they won't be held liable. That's what quit means.
Not
It's the same as our word acquitted. That means they won't be held guilty for what the ox did in that case. But we're about to talk about they will be held guilty if something else. So we're going to look at that. But that's what I mean. That's what we're talking about. If that person didn't know anything about this animal and this animal suddenly did that and killed the person, then the owner of that ox would not be held accountable because it was an animal. But nobody also would eat the flesh. They would not profit from this death. The ox would be killed, it would be stoned, and it would not, no one would profit from it. Okay? But if in the past this ox had been aggressive, right? Had thrust its horns at somebody in the past, not caused any damage, but you knew this ox had a tendency to be aggressive. If the owner knew that, and the owner did not properly restrain this ox and keep them from being able to hurt anyone, and they hurt someone, then that owner is responsible. That means that if that ox had done all of that and the owner knew that, but he didn't control the animal, that he was guilty of murder and punished as such. Now, it says he would be able to pay a fine for his life. Instead of being put to death, he could settle that with money. But remember, again, it's not a premeditated thing, and that's one of the reasons why he's able to settle it with money. He could possibly settle it with money, but the survivors of the dead man would have to determine that amount, and it would have to be an acceptable amount in order for them to accept it. And if he didn't want to pay that, then the penalty was death. So that was a choice he had.
You mean to tell me if they knew that he'd done that before, that he could do that by himself out of it?
He could. He could buy his life. In other words, instead of him being killed, it was the same thing as it was for these other instances where a death was caused and the penalty was death. Then they could turn around and settle for a sum of money to that family and pay restitution and not be killed, because it wasn't premeditated. Because it wasn't something that they did and they said, I'm going to murder this person. It wasn't murder. Was it manslaughter? Yeah, he knew that that ox was wild, but he didn't restrain him, so it could be manslaughter. But he had an opportunity to pay a restitution to the family and not be put to death himself, because it wasn't murder, wasn't premeditated. So, but if he did not pay, then the penalty was death. That was the answer to that. Okay? So, if there was put a sum of money, he could pay it and redeem his life. Now, if it gored a son or a daughter, then the judgment shall be the same, basically the same thing. If it gored a son or a daughter, it was just the same as if it was an adult, the man of the family or an adult. The same penalties applied. But if the ox gored a servant, then what applied was he paid 30 shekels of silver. Okay? 30 shekels of silver, that's what he paid. Now, 30 shekels of silver was a whole lot of money, but it was still not a life, right? It was a whole lot of money. But just to put this in context, just want you to think about this. 30 shekels of silver was paid for the life of the servant that died, if the servant's life was taken. How much did they pay for Jesus?
30 shekels.
30 shekels of silver.
30 shekels.
That's what they gave Judas, 30 shekels of silver for turning Jesus into him. Jesus was killed for 30 shekels of silver. Same thing. Just to put that in a little context. So, again, we're now looking at the animals, and we're looking at how that works out. And if an animal kills a person, but now what if you injured somebody's animal? I mean, again, this is how they make their living, right? So what if you did something to somebody's animal? Now, you know, people sometimes do crazy things. You know, I knew of a person that there was an animal they didn't like, And so they poisoned some food and put it out there for the animal to eat it because they wanted to get rid of that animal. Just because they didn't like it. It barked too much or whatever it was. So they decided they'd get rid of it. There's people that just, whatever reason, they treat them that way. I'm not a cat person. I don't care for cats. But I'm not going to go treat a cat badly, but some will.
Yeah.
Some will. Okay? Some people just mean like that. Some people don't intentionally maybe try to hurt an animal, but still can.
Yeah.
So let's look at 33 through 36. And that'll wrap us up with this chapter. And it'll wrap us up with our study tonight. And if a man opens a pit, or if a man digs a pit and does not cover it, and an ox or a donkey falls in it, the owner of the pit shall make it good. He shall give money to their owner, but the dead animal shall be his. If one man's ox hurts another so that it dies, then they shall sell the live ox and divide the money from it, and the dead ox they shall also divide. Or if it was known that the ox tended to thrust in time past, and its owner is not kept it confined, he shall surely pay ox for ox, and the dead animal shall be his own. Okay? So, what are we talking about here? Basically this. These pits, these things that they would dig, basically they did a lot of that for grain storage, water storage. Sometimes there were pits that were used for traps, but they would dig those pits and put them out there, and if they did that and left it open and an animal wandered into it and fell and died because they fell into that pit, then they were responsible. And so then they owed the person that lost the animal, but the animal that fell in the pit now belonged to them. So before, when nobody should eat the flesh, if the ox fell in there and died, they paid for the ox, but they got to keep the meat. So the person that dug the pit did. Okay? If two ox got in a fight, and I keep using ox because that's the primary animal they were using to work with, but if two oxen got in a fight, and one of them killed the other one, then they had to sell the one that was still alive. They split the money, and then they split the meat of the one that died. The two of them had to figure it out. So, because they couldn't decide which man's ox was the one that was, it's kind of like who started the fight. I don't know. So that's how they settled it. Sir?
Been several years back, but when the cattle used to just roam the country,
Yep.
then they started, the lawyers got into it and
Yep,
made them build fences.
yep.
And so that way, you hit on it a while ago. Let me let that thing get quiet.
They don't pay them back.
But anyway, if you hit somebody's cow out on the highway,
Yep.
then you was looking for the man to own that cow.
Right.
And if you could find him, he'd be in big trouble.
Right.
But who's gonna admit ownership of a cow that's been hit by a car and people killed in it?
You're not gonna get nobody to admit.
Yeah. But you're right. They put the fences up so that if the cow got out the fence and you hit it, then that made it different, right? Because the man had done all they could to keep the cow contained, but if the cow got out of the fence, then he wasn't any more responsible after the cow got out. But if he had no fence and the cow got out, then he would have been responsible because he let that cow roam out there. So same type of thing in this is who's responsible and how do they settle it. If two oxen got in a fight, one killed the other one, who started the fight? You gonna have a trial, figure out which ox started the fight? No. One ox killed the other one. So the one that got killed, they split the meat. The one that was still alive, because it was an ox that caused all that, they had to sell it. Because why would one get to keep the ox instead of, they had to sell it and split the money. So they kept half the meat, half the money. But if it was a man that had an ox that had already been trying to hurt people and done all of that sort of thing, then that was different. If it was one that was already trying to hurt people, it was known that the ox tried to thrust and done whatever, then the owner has not confined it, then he will pay ox for ox, and the dead animal shall be his own. So he gets to keep the dead animal, but he's got to provide an ox for the other man, right? Because of what he'd done. So it's it was all all of this was set up to have a civilized society. One that would put laws in society that would help people know how they were supposed to act in order to be exactly how God showed them to be, right? Instead of being the way that they were in the past, they were putting laws in place to help them know what is the right way to do things. And by putting those laws in place, it made everything better because then people knew how it was settled. Before that, it's a big argument. Before that, people killed each other over nothing. Before that, there were all these things that happened. But all these that went into place helped them know how they were supposed to do things. And they continue today. I mean, most of these laws that we read, a lot of them, we start talking about an ox killing another man's ox and all that. But as Brother Gene just pointed out, some of that same stuff applies today, just in a different way. There's so much of it that just tells us, how do we deal with our fellow man? How are we supposed to deal with them, and how are we supposed to deal with them in a way that's pleasing to God? Well, this was the foundation to show you exactly how to do that. You've been in a society and a slave for 400 years. You grew up in that. You don't know anything. Now you're going to know what is the right way. Okay? So how do we learn that? All right. Again, we will try to pick up on chapter 22 at our next meeting, and we'll continue to be talking about more of those kind of laws. But we'll pick up in chapter 22. For those of you that joined us online tonight, thank you for joining. I pray that I didn't confuse you too bad. Hopefully you got some things out of this, and you'll come back and join us again next week. But for tonight, I just want to tell you, God bless and good night.